Well, New Mexico prosecutors said they plan to file new charges against Alec Baldwin for the on-set death of cinematographer Halyna Hutchins, and here they have indeed done it. Late last week, a grand jury indicted Alec Baldwin on 2 alternative counts of involuntary manslaughter. And in this video, we are going to go into what those charges are and what all of it means for the future of Alec Baldwin, as well as for the case against him. And we're going to talk about why these charges may not necessarily be a walk in the park for the prosecution. Let's get into it. Okay, so to make sure that we are all on the same page here, on October 21st, 2021, Alec Baldwin was on set for the indie movie Rust in New Mexico when the revolver he was holding to prepare for a scene went off. There was a live bullet in the revolver which passed through cinematographer Halyna Hutchins, killing her shortly after, and then was lodged in the shoulder of director Joel Souza, who recovered from the injury at a nearby hospital. Alec Baldwin was eventually charged after a long investigation, along with the set's armorer, Hannah Gutierrez-Reed, and the assistant director, David Hall. Hall took a plea deal where he got 6 months unsupervised probation, and Gutierrez-Reed continues to fight the charges against her. However, her case is expected to begin jury selection on February 21st of this year, and trial is expected to start the next day. If you're interested in a more detailed coverage of her case and of her trial, let me know in the comments down below. Anyway, the charges against Alec Baldwin were eventually dropped after one of them had to be removed because it was improperly brought. This is because one of the charges, an enhancement charge for the fact that there was a firearm involved, was brought under a law that was enacted after the incident occurred. And as anyone who has taken the bar exam in any state will tell you, it's unconstitutional to apply a new criminal law to a person for doing something that either wasn't illegal at the time of the incident or didn't have as severe a punishment at the time that the incident happened. This was one of a number of missteps by the Santa Fe County DA's office, and quite honestly, a little embarrassing that they missed this one in particular. But regardless, after those charges were dropped, they did come out with a statement saying that the journey for Alec Baldwin was not yet finished because they were still actively investigating him. And eventually there was another statement that came out saying that they were intending to charge him, they were planning to charge him based on new evidence that they had uncovered. And so now in early 2024, here we are with new charges and a fresh indictment. So what exactly has he been charged with? There are 2 charges for which the grand jury indicted him. Both of them are involuntary manslaughter charges, and both are 4th-degree felonies. The first one is involuntary manslaughter involving negligent use of a firearm. This means that the state is alleging that at the time of the incident, Baldwin was not handling a firearm with properly due care, and that as a result of that negligence, he caused the death of Halyna Hutchins. This charge requires evidence showing that the defendant used a firearm in a manner that any reasonable person would have considered to be unsafe, and that doing so endangered another person. There are a number of statements that Alec Baldwin has made about the incident which could point to a negligent handling of the revolver, to include this one.
I'm holding the gun where she told me to hold it, which ended up being aimed right in below her armpit, was what I was told. I don't know. This was a completely incidental shot, an angle that may not have ended up in the film at all. But we kept doing this, and so then I said to her, now in this scene, I'm going to cock the gun. And I said, do you want to see that? And she said, yes. So I take the gun and I start to cock the gun. I'm not going to pull the trigger. I said, do you see that? She goes, well, just cheat it down and tilt it down a little bit like that. And I cock the gun. I go, can you see that? Can you see that? Can you see that? And she says, and then I let go of the hammer of the gun and the gun goes off. I let go of the hammer of the gun and the gun goes off.
At the moment. The decisive
That was the
moment
the gun went off, yeah. That was the moment the gun went off.
Now, the other charge that he's facing, like I said, is another involuntary manslaughter charge. But this one is with essentially a recklessness state of mind. Specifically, the charge is that he acted with total disregard or indifference for the safety of others, and that the act was such that an ordinary person would anticipate that the death might occur under the circumstances. In other words, for this charge, the prosecution is going to need to show that he, on some level, recognized that there was some sort of a risk to the personal safety of the people around him that he was creating by doing the thing that he was doing, and that he disregarded that risk. And it has to be the kind of activity that basically anyone would look at it and say, you could end someone's life by doing that. But here's the thing about both of these charges. I look at both of them and I think if this were anywhere but on a movie set, this would probably be a fairly open and shut case. But because this was on a movie set, I expect the defense team to make a very, very vigorous argument about a couple things. First, the question as to how live rounds made it on set is one that I think a lot of people really hang on to in talking about this case. And I fully expect the defense to try to bring that up as much as they possibly can to try to shift the blame from Alec Baldwin to someone else who may have had or did have more responsibility over the kinds of rounds that were on set and inside the firearm. However, regardless of where those live rounds came from, one thing that everyone has to keep in mind is that every person that handles any dangerous item needs to handle it with due caution and care. As an example, things go wrong with cars all the time. Someone jumps in your blind spot, a tire goes out, etc. Oh, hello, kitty. Hi. You coming to say hi? Those things going wrong are exactly why a person needs to drive with care every time they get behind the wheel. Okay, let's go over here. Similarly, the same thing goes for anyone that is handling a firearm. If you don't know with certainty what condition that firearm is in, you cannot assume that it is in a safe condition. This is the argument that I personally would make if I were on the prosecution. And I would also argue that the question as to who brought those live rounds on set is really just a red herring that is meant to distract the jury from the real issues in this case, which is whether Alec Baldwin did the things that he was supposed to do to maintain safety on set. Now, the other point that I fully expect the defense to harp on, which is probably actually going to be an even bigger argument for them, is the idea of the reasonable person. Remember that both charges here involve an element of proving that Baldwin failed to do what a reasonable person would do as to the safety of the people around him. And the big question here is going to be, how do we define a reasonable person? When we talk about a reasonable person standard, this is a standard about mindset. And so oftentimes in these kinds of cases, we also have to consider the possibility of a cultural influence when we're talking about a reasonable person standard. So in this particular case, will reasonable person be defined as the average person in the general population? Or will this be defined as the average person who walks onto a film set for the purposes of shooting a movie? If it's the general population, of course, this would absolutely be unreasonable for Alec Baldwin to have made as many safety assumptions as he made on set. He didn't check the gun for live rounds, nor did he watch anyone else check it for live rounds. He assumed that someone had checked the gun outside of his presence and outside of his line of sight, and he assumed that when the assistant director called it a cold gun, meaning that it had no live rounds, that he had personally confirmed it or had gotten that confirmation from someone else. He also assumed that everything was perfectly safe, even though there was no plexiglass barrier between him and the people he was aiming the gun at to prepare the camera angles for the next scene. The list goes on. But if it's a so-called Hollywood standard, meaning what a reasonable person on a movie set would do, that could be a bit different here. On a movie set, there is a hefty load of responsibility for safety on set that is placed on the prop department and especially the armorer. There's a reason why certain practices are put in place on a movie set to include the use of the term cold gun when someone places a gun in an actor's hand. And then there's the fact that Baldwin held none of those roles. He's an actor after all. Now he's also a producer, and that could very well shape how well this kind of argument is received. But actors are typically acting under the guidance of the prop department. So how much responsibility should be placed on their shoulders? Of course, I personally would make the argument that the standard should be that everyone who handles a dangerous item on set, from the armorer to the assistant director to the actor, also bears responsibility of handling it with due care, because regardless of whether it's on set or in the so-called real world, it's still a dangerous item. But then again, even if there is a separate standard for Hollywood, we can also look closer at the defendant in question to further add some nuance as to what that standard should be. And in the end, this could end up bringing the case back towards the general population standard as opposed to this more loosey-goosey Hollywood standard. You see, anytime someone has a particular expertise or experience in a particular area or field, the law often places a higher standard on them than they would on the average person because they tend to know more than the average person. This is why doctors in some cases might be held to a higher standard as to how they act around someone someone's personal injury, for example. And a lawyer will be held to a higher standard on all kinds of things under the law. And here, Baldwin is not just a newbie actor who has never handled a gun on set before. This is a seasoned actor who has been a headliner for decades. And not only that, he's handled firearms on set many times, at least 18 times in movies and 4 times on TV. This includes movies like Heaven's Prisoners, The Edge, and The Hunt for Red October.
Be careful what you shoot at. Huh? Most things in here don't react too well to bullets.
Right.
So it's not like he's never been given the rundown on gun safety on a film set before. And because of that, he could end up getting a higher standard placed on him than the average movie set person. So, in short, I expect the defense to argue heavily that this case should be looked at differently than your average negligent firearm handling case because everyone on set was of the same mindset to properly assume that the safety of the item was being closely managed by professionals that they thought that they could trust. Of course, there's even evidence of other incidents happening on set before this that suggests people on set, to include Alec Baldwin, probably couldn't have reasonably held that assumption of safety being managed, but I don't want to digress any further on this point in this particular video. The point is, this is likely where a big fight is going to happen between both sides. And if the prosecution is thinking properly about this case, they're likely going to turn right around and bring in all of Alec Baldwin's filming history in which he's handled a firearm to counter that argument. If I were on the prosecution, I would be talking to any and every armorer that Alec Baldwin has ever worked with to ask them about what they taught Baldwin along the way and how they instructed him to handle a firearm on set. And then I would want to bring them in as witnesses at trial. And that's because as a person goes along in their life, they're supposed to take the things that they've learned along the way and apply them to new events and circumstances. This is especially true in professional settings. So while it's of course possible to forget something you've learned before, the prosecution could have a great argument if they bring in like every single one of his former armorers that he's ever worked with to say that they trained him in the way that he was supposed to be trained to handle a firearm. In other words, that he really should have known better. Anyway, this whole average population reasonable standard versus the Hollywood reasonable standard is the thing that really angers a lot of people regarding this case, particularly people who feel that there often is a separate standard for Hollywood and everyone else. And honestly, I completely understand that, and myself have joined in that outrage from time to time. There's simply a lot that Hollywood gets away with that most places, like most employers, for example, could never get away with. Not even by a long shot. And I'll be honest, I think it would be a good thing to send a message to Hollywood that every single person who handles a dangerous item on set is responsible for the safety of that item when it's under their care. Although it might be alarming for actors that now they have to worry about a certain level of liability at times, it's not exactly a bad thing for someone to say something like, hey, you're going to be responsible in this scene for handling a Siberian tiger. Don't do anything stupid while you're near it. This goes with wild animals, firearms, explosives, automobiles, and more. On-set safety should always be a priority. But I am predicting that this fight will occur around which standard should be applied to Alec Baldwin, and I'm honestly not sure which side will win. And in the end, I really do think that this is likely to be a big deciding factor in this case. In other words, whoever wins the reasonable person standard argument could very well mean winning the case as a whole at trial. But those are my thoughts. What do you think? There is a lot here about who should properly be held responsible. And I know a lot of people have a lot of strong thoughts and opinions and feelings about it. Do you agree or disagree with me? Tell me why in the comments down below. Otherwise, I hope you enjoyed this or at least found it interesting or informative. And if you did, I would love it if you could hit the like button. It does help us with YouTube algorithm gods. And if you're new here and you want to see more content like this, be sure to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell so you can find out when the next video is uploaded. See you in the next one.